Good morning, folks.
Good morning.
Welcome back as we rub the sleep out of our eyes, right? At 8 a.m.s are tough classes. Okay, well, we're going to get started here. So good morning to you, everybody. I hope you're doing well this morning. We do have lab today, of course, and we'll have some interesting information to talk about in lab today. So do you have any questions about anything before we get started? Our goal today is to get considerably further in chapter 6 here. Okay, well, let's get started then. I'm going to share my screen with you.
Oops, sorry, I had a quick question.
Okay.
Do we have a study guide for the lab exam is what I was wondering.
Basically, Kendall, your study guide is your word bank for the
Okay.
skeletal muscles. There won't be a separate study guide, okay?
Okay. And then will all the views from the lab exam be from visible body, or will they be from the textbook, or will they be like last time where they were from visible body?
They will be from visible body, except when I'm asking you a histology question.
Right.
Those will come from the histology packet.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, any other questions? All right, let's continue here. I'm going to share my screen and bring up a comment from our notes last time. Okay, so from last time, we ended with this idea talking about the cells of bone tissue, the bone histology, if you will. We made a comment that there's a tug of war within your bone to maintain the proper physical characteristics, the density, for example, by balancing these processes of deposition that are carried out by osteoblasts and resorption, which are carried out by osteoclasts. Okay, so once again, those cells are visually shown to you in figure 6.2. And you know, it is hard to visualize these processes and what's going on inside the bones. You know, it's hard to imagine what this actually looks like. So I'm going to start today by showing you a video, which, you know, honestly is not a perfect video. I don't know that there is any such thing as a perfect video. But what I'm saying is it's the best video that I've ever come across that does a respectable job of giving you a way to think about the activity of cells inside the bone tissue itself, okay? So let me run this forward. It's about 3.5, 4 minutes long, not too long. And hopefully it will give you a way to start thinking about the concepts of deposition and resorption as they're taking place in the bones themselves. Okay, so let's get this rolling here. Right. So I have linked this video in your notes already, so you'll be able to watch it again at home, okay? All right, so here we go, folks. Enjoy.
The skeleton changes across the human lifespan. This is characterized predominantly by bone formation and growth throughout childhood, followed by a gradual loss of bone density that begins in early adulthood that can accelerate significantly in older adults. The density of bone is modulated by a group of cells including osteoclasts, which are multinucleated cells that resorb bone, and osteoblasts, which refill the resorption cavities created by osteoclasts. Osteoclasts anchor themselves to the surface of bone. This creates a microenvironment underneath the cell, which is referred to as the sealed zone. Within this zone, the osteoclasts create an acidic environment that dissolves the bone's mineral content. Once the mineral content of the bone has been dissolved, enzymes released from osteoclasts remove the remaining collagenous bone matrix to complete the process of resorption. Following resorption, osteoblasts move into the resorption space and start to produce and deposit organic matrix called osteoid. Osteoid, a substance made predominantly of collagen, forms a scaffold in which minerals including calcium and phosphate begin to crystallize. Some active osteoblasts become trapped within the matrix they secrete and thereby become osteocytes. Other osteoblasts will undergo apoptosis or will revert back to lining cells which cover the surface of bone. This cycle of bone resorption and formation is referred to as remodeling. There is also a process where bone formation by osteoblasts occur without prior bone resorption by osteoclasts. This results in an increase in bone mass and is referred to as bone modeling. Bone modeling promotes the growth of bones and is important for maintaining bone strength. Remodeling also plays an important role during bone growth by optimizing the growing structure. After the age of 30, most people experience a gradual loss in bone mass due to a relative decrease in the activity of osteoblasts compared with osteoclasts. However, there are many factors that impact the process of bone remodeling and influence the degree of bone loss we experience as we age. For example, medications such as glucocorticoids, which can promote osteoclast activity and also reduce bone formation. Proper nutrition and physical activity can help strengthen bone. It is also believed that osteocytes form a complex network in bone that can sense any increased workload on the bone and respond by triggering the differentiation and activity of osteoblasts to increase bone density. Conversely, when bone experiences reduced loading conditions, such as during long-term bed rest, resorption and remodeling increase to eliminate underloaded bone. Loss of bone mass reduces its strength and increases the risk of fracture. This highlights the importance of staying active, maintaining good nutrition throughout life, and being aware of personal risk factors associated with low bone density.
Okay, folks. So hopefully, that gives you yet another way to start thinking about some of the activity that's actually happening inside our bones, which is largely invisible to us, on in an everyday way of thinking about things. Okay. We'll be talking about calcium homeostasis in the bloodstream, most likely next class. But what I wanted to tell you now is, since you've seen this video, if the level of calcium gets too low in your bloodstream, then your body will seek to elevate the blood calcium levels by pulling calcium out of the extracellular matrix of the bone. And so now you have a video which you've just seen where you're seeing some osteoclasts form that sealed zone. You remember that phrase, sealed zone? And it showed you this red image in the video where the osteoclast was acidifying the environment, and that was causing the extracellular matrix to break down. That whole process is involved in pulling calcium out of the extracellular matrix so it can be pushed back into the bloodstream to elevate blood calcium levels. At the same way, if your blood calcium is too high and your body doesn't need all that extra calcium in the bloodstream, what will happen is the osteoblasts will be able to take the calcium that's being pushed from the bloodstream into the bones and deposit in a mineralized way into the matrix of the bone. It'll be able to stick it down, glue it down, and build new extracellular matrix. Okay, so Again, not a perfect video, but maybe it gives you a way to start conceiving of the activity that's happening inside the bone. Let's talk about, did you have any questions from watching the video? Before I leave this topic, I think it would be helpful for us to at least mention two very common bone disorders that I bet you know about, or at least one of them you've certainly heard of before. And why it's appropriate to talk about these bone disorders here in this moment of our conversation is because the bone disorders have to do with abnormal amounts of deposition or abnormal amounts of resorption. Okay, so the first bone disorder is acromegaly. Okay, acromegaly is a bone disease where you get overly thick bones. This is a condition characterized by overly thickened bones. Okay. Scientists believe that the over-thickening of the bones is due to excessive deposition caused by excessive osteoblast activity. Okay, and so I may have shown you this before last time, but I'll just flash up an image here of some acromegaly folks. Let's just take a look perhaps at this one once again, where you can see the difference of a normal sized hand on the left versus an acromegaly hand on the right, where you can see a very prominent thickening of the fingers and so forth. Okay, so that's common with acromegaly patients, you know, and you can also see the photos that you see in front of you here. People start to take on very prominent facial features. Look at this poor individual's hand over here, right? I mean, you get an unwanted thickening of the bones. Okay, so that's acromegaly, and that is associated with excessive osteoblast activity. The other disease that you may be more familiar with is osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is sort of a brittle bone disease. This is a condition characterized by a weakening of bone tissue. Okay. Science believes that this condition is caused by excessive osteoclast activity. Causing excessive bone resorption. Okay, so you may have already had a question or two about this in your homework. I'm not entirely sure what stage of your homework you'll get this, but I know there is at least one question in the homework about osteoporosis. And just to show you, you know, for example, right here, you can see on the left what healthy bone extracellular matrix kind of looks like. An osteoporotic bone is going to be much more airy, much more light. The holes inside the matrix are going to be much bigger and much deeper. So you have less bone density, less strength in the bone, and it's easy for bones to fracture under these circumstances. Osteoporosis is more common in women, although men and women can both get it. Okay. Let me ask you a question in the chat window here. Do you know anyone with osteoporosis? Okay, it's a very common condition, particularly in our seniors. There's a good chance that, you know, there's a good chance that if you don't know someone that has been medically diagnosed with osteoporosis, there's a good chance you still know someone that has it, right? So, I mean, if you know anyone who's a senior citizen, you know, there's going to be some level of osteoporosis present, whether it's Whether it clinically manifests in a problematic way is another question. But all of us know older folks, right? So we do know folks that have arthritis, that have osteoporosis, all of these kinds of conditions. Years ago, my aunt, who's now been passed quite a few years ago, she was just walking down the sidewalk one day, and all she did was she was stepping off the sidewalk to cross the street, nothing strenuous. And in that simple act of stepping off the sidewalk, her hip fractured. She broke her hip just by stepping down off the sidewalk, okay, because she had some pretty significant osteoporosis. Okay. All right, folks, we are going to leave this topic of bone cells, deposition, resorption. Any questions you'd like to ask before I move forward? Okay. All right, then let's continue forward here. The next talking point is to describe what is known as compact and spongy bone tissue. For this, I'm going to be utilizing figure 6.3. So I'm going to ask you to please have open figure 6.3 in your textbook so that you can look at it as we go along together, okay? Okay, so compact bone, figure 6.3, okay. All right, well, what to say here? Okay, let's start off by mentioning that compact bone is the outermost surface of bone. So, you know, next week when you're all out trick-or-treating, either for yourself or with your children, and you come across a house that has a Halloween skeleton out, you know, when you look at the bones of the skeleton, when you look across the driveway and you see the skeleton, when you look at the surface of the bones, you are looking at compact bone. The compact bone is that kind of tissue of the bone that is on the surface of the bone. This is the type of bone tissue that forms the surface of bone. Okay. As you recall from our conversation last time, when we talked about the anatomy of a long bone, right? Remember the bone itself is wrapped in a membrane called the periosteum. So what I'm telling you here is that compact bone is the surface of the bone, and this compact bone is actually covered by the periosteum. You can verify that for yourself. If you look carefully at figure 6.3, the primary big image in the center of the page, okay? So I'm looking at image A as in apple. If you look at the bottom of that image, you see two brackets. On the left side, you see spongy bone. And the larger of the two brackets says compact bone. On the right side of the compact bone, you'll again recall that I highlighted the periosteum, okay? So compact bone is wrapped in the periosteum membrane, okay? In terms of the two major types of bone tissue that makes up bone, so compact bone and spongy bone, compact bone is the stronger variety of tissue. Compact bone is stronger than spongy bone, okay? The strength of compact bone comes about because of its structural organization. I mean, basically you have the same material in compact bone as spongy bone, but you have more quantities of it in the compact bone, and it is physically arranged differently with a different pattern. Okay, so compact bone is stronger than spongy bone. Compact bone is made of repeating subunits called osteons. Okay, so take a look carefully at figure 6.3. In sort of the middle of the picture, you see an osteon that's highlighted. Osteons are these cylindrical tube-like structures that make up most of the fabric of the compact bone anatomy. Osteons are also known as Haversian systems. Okay, they're a very prominent feature of bone. I'm sure as you've been, working to figure out your histology packet for lab today, I think the bone image was fairly straightforward. I mean, you could match it with the image of your textbook pretty easily. Okay. All right, so let's give you a little bit of detail about these osteons. Okay, each osteon, if you look very carefully, you can tell that the osteon looks like it's made of different circles that are overlapping each other or surrounding each other. Each one of these circles or rings, these concentric rings, have a name. Each individual ring is called a lamella, And so a group of concentric rings that are on top of each other or wrapped around each other are called lamellae. Okay, each osteon is made of a series of concentric rings called lamellae. Okay, these lamellae are really made of crystallized minerals, particularly the calcium and phosphorus minerals that I've been harping on for some time. These are made of crystallized minerals. And you notice that in the center of the osteon, in the center of these overlapping concentric rings, there's an open space. Okay, that open space is the central canal. Notice the hollow center of each osteon, called the central canal, or Haversian canal, if you will. Depending on what textbooks you read, you'll get different language here. Okay, so I'm just going to underline some of these terms in your notes to be sure that you appreciate that they are significant vocab words, right? So notice the central canal, and you'll notice that, at least in this image, it's showing you that through the central canal, you're seeing blood vessels, right? Arteries and veins that are penetrating deep into the interior of the bone, providing necessary oxygen and nutrients to the bone tissue, to the cells that live in this physical space. Okay. Notice the blood vessels running through the central canal. It is also possible that you can get some nerve endings running through the central canal as well, because your bones, your bones need to report different information to the central nervous system about their health and well-being. Your bones might communicate information to the central nervous system, and the central nervous system responds then by releasing hormones from the endocrine system. Okay, so there has to be a communication between the bone tissue and the nervous system that is achievable by having nerve fibers go through the central canals of the bone. Okay. All right. Let's take a look here at the magnified image of figure 6.3. So if you look at picture A, you see the primary image, and then you see the osteon, and if you scan your eyes gently to the right, you see a little gray arrow that's pointing to the upper right corner, and you see a magnified, blown up image of something. I want to focus on that just a little bit here. Okay, so consider the magnified image in the upper left corner, the upper right corner of figure 6.3a. Okay, and so what I'd like to point out here is now, so now we know what the lamella are, right? We know what these concentric rings of minerals are called. These are the lamella, okay? And what I'd like to point out to you is that in between the borders of one ring and another ring, there's additional material here. So in between the lamella are these spaces called lacuna. Lacuna is singular, lacunae is plural. So see if you can notice the lacuna, okay, in the upper right magnified area, you see the bone lacuna, and notice how they are positioned in between the different rings of minerals that are in the compact bone. Okay, notice the lacuna, which are positioned in between overlapping rings of lamella. Okay. The lacuna are actually pockets of space. They are depressions. They are cavities in the soil, if you will. If I could use a quick analogy, if you were walking along the Gettysburg battlefield immediately after the Gettysburg battle actually happened during the Civil War, if you were walking along the battlefield, undoubtedly you would go across the soil, across the earth, and you would find some places where there's just a giant hole in the ground, right? A cavity that's been dug out of the ground from the impact of a cannonball. That's what a lacuna is. It's not the cannonball, it's the divot in the soil. So the lacuna are pockets of space in the minerals that allow for a cell to be positioned. So in that lacuna, you're going to find typically an osteocyte. You could find other varieties of cells we've also documented as well. You could find osteoprogenitor cells. You could find osteoblasts there as well. The lacuna are pockets of space in the minerals of the bone tissue that allow a bone cell to reside. So bone cells kind of live and position themselves. They take up residence in the lacuna. Okay. Bone cells like osteocytes to reside. Okay. Additionally, okay, so let me just ask you here. Okay, have you been able to identify the lamella and lacunae in figure 6.3? Are you okay right now? Okay, all right, great. Please, please slow me down. Please ask questions if you're not able to locate these terms that I'm presenting to you, okay? All right, so the lacuna are these pockets of space that the cells are in. There's something else significant. If you look very carefully at the magnified image in the upper right corner, not only do you see the pocket of space, but you notice that these weird little channels, these little weird extensions, these little weird, I would call them troughs, in one way of thinking about it, troughs that come off the lacuna. And these little channels or fibers or extensions, these channels, these burrows are called canaliculi. Okay, so notice the canaliculi, which are extensions or channels, you pick your word, or troughs that project away from the lacuna. Okay, kind of an odd word, that word canaliculi. All right, the purpose of the canaliculi is to allow your bone cells to reach out tiny little cytoplasmic extensions. So, imagine for a moment that you are Mr. Fantastic of the Fantastic Four comic book. And I know you might not all know him, but some of you probably do. He's the guy that's really stretchy. So imagine that you are Mr. Fantastic and you can extend your arms and continue to stretch them out into the next room across the hallway in your home. Well, bone cells can do that. They can be Mr. Fantastic. They can extend cytoplasmic arms through the canaliculi channels and actually communicate with neighboring bone cells so that you actually form a sort of cellular network through the canaliculi channel anatomy of the bone tissue. Okay. So let's say it this way. Osteocytes have the ability to extend cytoplasmic, I'll just put in quotations because I'm using this word very loosely, cytoplasmic arms through the canaliculi to touch and communicate with other bone cells in the neighborhood. Okay. Additionally, the channels, the troughs that are the canaliculi, also provide a way to get oxygen and nutrients into the bone cells that are living in the lacuna, and also provide a way for any metabolic waste products that are building up from the respiration activities of the bone cells to get out of the bone tissue and ultimately be expelled from the body. So, think of the canaliculi as the road network, which allows food to come to your house and junk to leave your house. Okay. The canaliculi are also used to deliver oxygen and nutrients into bone cells and remove metabolic waste products from bone cells. Okay, so when you start, realizing what this anatomy allows the body to achieve, it starts to make a little bit more sense that you really have this kind of community or town or city or civilization of bone cells that are interconnected in part through the canaliculi anatomy of the bone tissue itself. Okay. All right. Folks, do you have any thoughts or questions right now? Okay. So, it is easy in a course like this where there's so much depth and volume of information and try to learn to get frustrated. But if you just step back for a moment and think about the amazing, wonderful, odd environment that Mother Nature has created in your body, it's truly breathtaking. I mean, it's strange and beautiful at the same time. Okay. All right, that's compact bone, folks. Let's move on to spongy bone. This is also figure 6.3. Again, if you're looking at picture A, the spongy bone is going to be along the left-hand side of picture A. You also see some features of spongy bone highlighted in picture B in the bottom left corner of figure 6.3, and figure C is in Charlie in the bottom right corner. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you a couple of features of spongy bone. Spongy bone is the type of bone tissue that is deep in the interior of the bone, which is to say you would never see spongy bone on the surface of the bone unless something was horribly wrong. The only way you would see spongy bone is if you fractured a bone and you could look at the inside of the fracture projecting out of your skin, which unfortunately does sometimes happen, right? So spongy bone is the deeper tissue inside bones. Okay. Spongy bone is always covered by the compact bone. So spongy bone is covered by compact bone. Compact bone is covered by the periosteum, right? Spongy bone is also known by two alternative names. It is also known as trabecular bone or cancellous bone tissue. Okay, and I will highlight the trabecular bone phrase as something of significance to you. If you look at some of the pictures of figure 6.3, you'll notice that, if you look along the left side of picture A, it looks like the spongy bone is made of these tiny little sharp-like projections, these sharp-like girders, these sharp-like beams. Those beams are called trabeculae. Okay, you can see them magnified and blown up in picture B of figure 6.3. That is probably the most common feature that we would typically consider when we look under the microscope, that you can see the trabeculae. Spongy bone is formed by quote unquote little beams known as trabeculae. Okay, in fact, the word trabecula means little beam. Trabecula means little beam, and you can see that there in the pictures. Okay, now spongy bone does not contain osteon. Okay, if you look at the picture there, you notice there are no osteons in the spongy bone. Okay, spongy bone does not contain osteon. Osteon is a structural feature of compact bone. Okay. Spongy bone does not contain osteons. Well, let's talk a little bit more about these trabeculae. Okay, the trabeculae are characteristic of the spongy bone. If you were to, do a more microscopic investigation of the trabeculae, what would you find? Well, you would still find most of the same materials you find in the compact bone, just arranged a little bit differently to form the trabeculae instead of the osteon. Okay, so inside the trabeculae, you will find lacuna. Okay, so we talked about lacuna in the compact bone. You will also find lacuna in the trabeculae. You will find canaliculi in the spongy bone, in the trabeculae. You will find all the varieties of bone cells we've talked about: osteoblasts, osteocytes, osteoclasts, right? They're all in the trabeculae at various moments of time. Okay, so, long story short, compact bone, osteon; spongy bone, trabeculae. What material makes up an osteon, what material makes up a trabeculae is basically the same material, but physically arranged differently. It's like having a pack of Lego bricks that you can assemble in two different ways. I can take the same bricks and I can build a car out of those bricks. Or alternatively, I can take the same bricks and arrange them differently to build a robot, like a transformer. Okay, so same building block material, but arranged differently. Okay. Also, if you glance your eyes at the spongy bone again, you'll notice that there's a lot more openness to the spongy bone. There's a lot of space in between the trabeculae, right? When you look at compact bone, you really don't see a lot of space because you have one ring of lamella on top of another ring of lamella, and there's just not a lot of open airiness between those rings. But in the spongy bone, you see more openness, and that is useful. Okay, notice the openness, or quote unquote airiness, and I'm just using that term very, very liberally. It's not, you're not going to have air there, but you're going to have openness. Notice the airiness, or the openness of space in between the trabeculae Okay, that openness is useful for several things. First off, the openness of the trabeculae means that there's less bone material in the spongy bone, which means the overall weight of our bones can be lighter than they otherwise would be, which then correspondingly means that the muscles that are being used to move the bone don't need to be quite as massive as they would otherwise need to be. Okay, so the openness of the trabeculae, the openness of the spongy bone allows bones to be lighter than they otherwise would be. And secondly, Mother Nature, it's often been said that Mother Nature abhors a vacuum, meaning that, usually Mother Nature wants to efficiently use space and volumes of space to store things. And this is no different here. Even though you will find areas where there just is openness between trabeculae, you can also find many examples where the space in between the trabeculae is used to store bone marrow. Okay, the open space in between trabeculae is used to store bone marrow. And of course, the kind of bone marrow you're going to store is going to depend on the kind of bone and the particular region of the bone we're interested in. Okay, so let me ask a question in the chat window. Here we go. What type of bone marrow would be stored in between the trabeculae of the spongy bone in the diaphysis of your femur? Okay, so there's a few sophisticated words in there, right? Some words that you need to get comfortable with. What type of bone marrow would be stored in between the trabeculae of the spongy bone in the diaphysis of the femur? Okay, so you got a 50-50 shot, right? You just guess here. Okay, just guess. Okay. Okay. All right. So folks, I appreciate you guessing. In this particular case, I got you on this one, right? It's not red marrow, it's going to be yellow marrow. Yellow marrow is predominantly stored in the diaphysis because you have more open area there, okay? So if you want to, go ahead and look back at figure 6.1 there, okay? And notice the diaphysis there of figure 6.1, you see the medullary cavity says it contains the yellow bone marrow, okay? The yellow bone marrow. Okay, all right. So at any rate, be aware that bone marrow is stored in the open space between the trabeculae of the spongy bone. Okay. I think that's basically all we really need to say about spongy bone. Do you have any questions at this time? Okay, let's continue then. All right, so I just want to make a couple comments about the processes of bone formation. I'm not going to hit this topic very hard because honestly, our knowledge of bone formation is still really in its infancy, which is to say, we don't have a deep understanding of how bones form. Bone formation is largely an invisible process that happens before you're ever born. So it's a topic that's really technically challenging to study this topic in the lab to figure out something that's going on that's largely invisible to the eye. It's just really hard to figure this kind of thing out. But I will make a few statements, and for those that are following along here, I'm going to be making just a couple quick statements about intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification, which are figures 6.5 and figure 6.6. Figure 6.5 and figure 6.6. Okay. Bone formation, figures 6.5 and 6.6. Okay, let's start with this. When you say bone formation, there are some fancy vocab words that are associated with the phrase bone formation. Okay, bone formation is more properly called ossification or osteogenesis. Okay, so when new bone needs to form, the body will perform the ossification process. The body will perform the osteogenesis process. Okay, so bone formation is more properly known as ossification or osteogenesis. Okay. All right. Basically, there's going to be 4 moments of your life which bone formation is actually going to take place. Okay. Bone formation will occur in 4 different moments, or if you prefer the word scenarios of your life. Here's what they are. Okay. Obviously, when your skeleton is first being created before you're ever born, when you're an embryo and a fetus, right? There is a technical difference between embryo and fetus in terms of the time of development during the pregnancy, but I won't worry about that at this moment. When your early fetal skeleton is being first created, obviously that is a moment where bone formation is going to occur. Okay, so during formation of your fetal skeleton before birth, a second area where you're going to have significant bone formation is during the growth of your skeleton, you know, from when you're an infant to when you become a child, to when you become an adolescent, and finally a mature adult, right? During these stages of development of your life that we've all been through at this point, because we've all reached physical adulthood, right? I mean, you're much taller today than you were when you were 4 years old, okay? So during growth of your skeleton from infancy, childhood, adolescence, to mature adult size. The third moment, or I should say many moments of this type that you're going to occur, is during bone remodeling. And bone remodeling is basically occurring, you know, every day in your body, you know, depending on the various stresses you are placing on your body, right? Whether you're exercising or not exercising, whether you're mowing the yard or not mowing the yard, you know, those physical stresses are causing your body to remodel the bones. What the health status of your immune system is. Are you fighting an infection? If you're fighting an infection, you might need more calcium from the extracellular matrix to support activity of immune system cells, right? So bone remodeling is going to be happening basically all the time. So you have small quantities of bone formation happening to various degrees all the time. Okay, so during bone remodeling, which is basically happening all the time as your body adjusts to different environmental stresses. Come on, there we go. And the fourth time, and probably the one that's most obvious, is during the healing process of repairing a bone fracture. So probably many of you, unfortunately, many of us, and during our life have had at least one experience with breaking a bone. Not everybody, but Many folks do, through sports injuries or whatever. And so during that moment, you are going to obviously form new bone. Okay. There are mainly two ways that new bone is formed, and those are the topics of figure 6.5 and figure 6.6. I'm not going to walk you through these processes. I don't see too much value in doing that with our time together, but I would like you to be aware of these processes, certainly know the terminology, and read through the stages during your private study time. So there are two main types of bone formation processes. They are intramembranous ossification. Okay, that is the topic of figure 6.5. Okay, let's just read through the different stages. I'm not going to put the stages in your note, but let's just read through these stages together here in class. If you have figure 6.5 in front of you, let's just read through this. So stage 1, which is highlighted by the number 1, it's inside a blue colored ball. Stage 1, development of an ossification center, the osteoblasts, and you know what osteoblasts are at this moment in our conversation. They secrete organic extracellular matrix. Stage 2, calcification. Calcium and other mineral salts are deposited and extracellular matrix calcifies, right? So calcium itself as a substance is extremely important in the bone building process. And you've always heard that probably in advertisements, calcium does a body good, right? Drink lots of milk, that kind of thing. We need that calcium for the bone forming processes. Stage 3, formation of the spongy bone trabeculae. So now you know what spongy bone is, and you also know what trabeculae are because we just talked about it. Continuing here, it says extracellular matrix develops into spongy bone trabeculae that fuse to form the spongy bone. And stage 4, development of the periosteum, the mesenchyme, which remember is primitive connective tissue cells. The mesenchyme at the periphery of the bone develops into the periosteum. Okay, so if you really think about it, as informative as those stages are, there's still a lot of detail that we really don't understand at the chemical and molecular level. Okay, so I don't want you to get too uptight about worrying about these things, but I do want you to be aware of them. So for intramembranous ossification, bone is formed directly in the bone is formed directly in the mesenchymal layer of cells, which again is embryonic connective tissue. In this process, bones are formed directly in the mesenchyme. If you don't remember what mesenchyme is, you can take a look at chapter 4 and it will reveal to you that it is a form of embryonic connective tissue. Okay. Let me give you a quick list of some of the bones of your skeleton that are actually manufactured in this manner. Okay, not all bones are made in the same way. So bones of the skeleton that are made by by intramembranous ossification include bones of your skull. Okay, most of your facial bones, your mandible, and oddly enough, the medial portion of your clavicle, the medial portion of your collarbone, okay, which is kind of strange to think about it that way, that the entire clavicle is not made by intramembranous ossification, only a region, only a portion, only a part of the collarbone is made in this way. Okay. Additionally, you're all familiar with the fontanelles of the infant skull, right? That was something that you were studying for your first lab exam when you were thinking about the bones fairly intently there. The fontanelles, you know, these are the soft spots that an infant is born with. Once a child is born, over the months after birth, those soft spots will harden. They will actually ossify and turn into legitimate bone tissue. Okay. Well, how do they ossify? They ossify by intramembranous ossification. The fontanelles of the infant skull harden, meaning they turn into bone by the intramembranous ossification process. Okay. All right, folks. So if you think about it, we listed out some bones here for intramembranous ossification, but there's many, many more bones we did not list. And that's to say that most of the bones of your skeleton actually form by the alternative bone forming process, which is endochondral ossification. So I'm going to put this as letter B in your notes. Okay. Endochondral ossification. Okay, in this method of forming bone, bone forms within and replaces a shell of hyaline cartilage, where the cartilage itself also develops from the mesenchyme. Okay, let me write this down, then I'll try to give you an analogy to think about this. Okay. If I could get my notes correct here. Okay. So endochondral ossification, in this process, bones form within and replaces the hyaline cartilage shells of quote unquote bone that form from the mesenchyme. Okay. All right. So let me give you an analogy which is not perfect, but maybe it will help you begin to think about this a little bit. So let me ask you a question in the chat window here. Here we go. Have you ever made or seen someone make Christmas cookies that look like Christmas trees or reindeers or Santa's head or snowflakes or any other number of things like this? Okay, maybe you've done some of that kind of baking. So I know some folks enjoy that activity. I tend to enjoy eating it. I don't tend to enjoy making it, but that just is what it is. So think about how that is typically done. If you think about it, if you're going to make a complicated Christmas tree cookie, doesn't the person doing this task, don't they typically have a cookie sheet, a sheet of tin, of metal, where you have a depression in the cookie sheet that you then fill up with batter? Okay. Question in the chat window. Am I making sense with a cookie sheet having depressions that are filled with batter? Can you visualize what I'm talking about? Okay. I hope you can. And so what I'm saying here is, like, forming bones through the endochondral ossification process is a little bit analogous to making Christmas cookies, where you fill up a depression in a cookie sheet. Okay, so forming bones through endochondral ossification is similar to baking Christmas cookies, or any cookie, right? It could be a Halloween cookie of a pumpkin. Baking Christmas cookies by placing batter into a depression in a baking sheet or baking tin, if you will. Okay, and what I'm going to say here is that when you build bone through endochondral ossification, the very first thing you have to do is make the cookie sheet itself. You have to make the cookie sheet itself. To make the Christmas cookies, let's be honest, for you and I to make a Christmas cookie, we go to a store or we order off Amazon a cookie baking sheet, a cookie tin, a cookie pan, or somebody that works with metals has already fabricated the cookie sheet for us, right? We just go buy it, but somebody someplace had to make that cookie sheet. The first thing that has to happen here is we need to make the cookie sheet. So we need to make, meaning we need to literally build, we need to construct we need to fabricate the cookie sheet with depressions. Okay, and so in terms of the biology that's going to take place, the cookie sheet is actually going to be made out of hyaline cartilage. Okay, so the cookie sheets that we purchase from the store are made out of some kind of metal, right? Aluminum or whatever metal it might be. But the cookie sheet for the bones is really made out of hyaline cartilage. In other words, the earliest form of our bones, of our skeleton, are literally made of molds of cartilage. They are not molds of bone. Okay. The earliest bones, and I'm using the word bone in quotation marks because it's not really bone. The earliest bones are really shells or molds of hyaline cartilage in the shape of what our bones will become. Okay. And so, I would be lying to you if I said we understand how the body does this, because we don't. This is like a miracle kind of thing. This is like a magical kind of thing. Obviously, it's not magical, and we might think of it, philosophically as a magical thing. There is biochemistry and biophysics processes happening to form the bones that we do not yet understand. We just don't understand it. It's beyond our ability to grasp at this moment. But we can observe, nonetheless, we have been able to observe that the earliest bones are really made of shells of cartilage, hyaline cartilage. That hyaline cartilage develops out of the mesenchyme, which is the embryonic connective tissue layer of the embryo that you are before you are born. Okay, so we make the cookie sheet with the depressions. We make the molds of the bones out of hyaline cartilage, and then, okay, in my analogy, after we've made the cookie sheet, we fill the cookie sheet up with batter. Okay, and what I mean by this in terms of the body is that slowly over time, through a process which is itself not deeply understood, that cartilage is gradually replaced with actual bone tissue, osseous tissue, and calcium plays a huge role in triggering that conversion of cartilage into actual bone tissue. So in the body, the hyaline cartilage molds are gradually replaced with legitimate bone tissue, okay, osseous tissue. So, I don't want you to get too much worked up about the nitty-gritty details, because I'm honestly telling you, we don't really know the nitty-gritty details. There's a lot we don't understand here. But let me walk us through figure 6.6. If you have it open in your textbook, let's just read the stages so that you have heard them, okay? So stage 1, figure 6.6. Stage 1, development of the cartilage model. The mesenchymal cells develop into chondroblasts. Chondroblasts are cartilage building cells. Just like osteoblasts are bone building cells, chondroblasts are cartilage building cells. So stage 1, development of the cartilage model. Mesenchymal cells develop into chondroblasts, which form the cartilage model, okay? Here we're building our cookie sheet. We're actually manufacturing our cookie sheet. Stage 2, growth of the cartilage model. Growth occurs by cell division, mitosis of chondrocytes. So chondrocytes reproduce, and we build the overall shape and size of what will ultimately become the bone. Stage 3, development of the primary ossification center. Okay, in this region of the diaphysis, bone tissue has replaced most of the cartilage. So again, there's a whole bunch of complicated things happening between stages 2 and 3 that we largely don't really appreciate scientifically yet. Stage 4, development of the bone marrow cavity. The bone breaks down by osteoclast activity. That should not be a surprise, because osteoclasts are responsible for bone resorption. That forms the medullary cavity, the bone marrow cavity. Stage 5, development of the secondary ossification centers. These centers occur in the proximal and distal epiphyses, which were introduced to you last lecture, in the bone. Stage 6, formation of articular cartilage and the epiphyseal growth plate. Both structures consist of hyaline cartilage. If we look at letter B there, you can see an image of a 12-week-old fetus. The red areas represent bones that are forming. Clear areas represent cartilage, okay? So it is an amazing process, which is still largely opaque to our best efforts to understand, but research continues. We're trying to figure this out, okay? Okay, folks, do you have any questions right now? Anything you'd like to ask about? Okay, so that gives you a little bit of idea about the process of how your bones are made. Okay, let me just mention two things that I'm not going to spend any classroom time on, but I certainly want you to read them during your private study time. If we are looking at figure 6.7 in your textbook, the paragraphs of information around figure 6.7 try to describe to you how your bones actually get longer, how your bones grow in length. And obviously, many of you know that has a lot to do with mitosis at the epiphyseal growth plate, which was introduced to you last lecture. So be sure that you've at least read through that. And also, not only do our bones grow longer, but they grow thicker. They grow thicker. Think about acromegaly. Think about the images of the hands I showed you half an hour ago or so. So growth and thickness of the bones can be explained by what's called appositional growth, and that would be figure 6.8 in your textbook, figure 6.8. So just be sure that you truly are reading across these things during your private study time. Okay, the next things that I'm going to put in your notes is give you a conversation about different factors that influence the growth and remodeling of our bone. There are no pictures for this, but there's some paragraphs of text. If you're looking at your textbook, there should be a a column heading that is somewhere after figure 6.6 in your book, where the figure heading, excuse me, the column heading is factors affecting bone growth and remodeling. Okay, let's get a couple of these things in the 5 minutes we have left in your notes. Okay, well, first off, minerals. That should not be a surprise to you, but there's a few aspects we haven't talked about before. So first off, large amounts of calcium and phosphorus minerals are going to be needed for bone deposition to grow the extracellular matrix to expand the physical dimensions of bone. Okay, large amounts of calcium and phosphorus minerals are needed for bone growth. Okay. In addition to that, there are other minerals that are needed in much smaller amounts, but are still significant for the physiology of bone. Small amounts of magnesium, fluoride, and yes, I mean the same kind of fluoride from a chemical perspective that you have in your toothpaste. Fluoride and manganese are needed for bone remodeling. Okay. These three items we've talked about here, magnesium, fluoride, and manganese, are actually elements on the periodic table of elements, that horrific thing you might recall from high school chemistry, right? So these are elements, right? These materials, right? Magnesium, fluoride, and manganese are chemical elements. But in the context of our current conversation of bone physiology, these elements in a mineral form will act as cofactors. They will act as cofactors, which are important for enzymes to do their jobs properly. Okay. So in an analogy sort of way, a cofactor like magnesium, fluoride, and manganese, a cofactor is kind of like a co-pilot for an airplane. If you think about an airplane, if you've ever flown, if you've flown a commercial flight, you're always going to have a pilot and a co-pilot, right? And they work together to ensure you get safely to your destination. Well, a cofactor like magnesium, fluoride, and manganese, they help enzymes fold into their correct three-dimensional shape. So they have the correct three-dimensional geometry so that they can do their chemistry correctly. Okay, so cofactors for enzymes are like co-pilots for airplanes. Okay, cofactors help enzymes fold into the correct shape so they can perform their jobs correctly. Okay. All right. Number two, vitamins. Okay, vitamins. There's a number of vitamins that are important for bone growth and remodeling. Vitamin A. Okay. Everybody, when you were growing up, mom and dad may have said, oh, you got to take your vitamins, you got to eat your vitamins. I used to take a Flintstone tablet vitamin when I was a little boy. Vitamin A stimulates activity of osteoblasts. Okay. Question in the chat window. Here we go. If you are deficient in vitamin A, would you expect to have a problem performing bone deposition or bone resorption? Okay. All right. So thanks for those that are participating. You will have a problem, and it's going to be a problem with deposition, right? It's going to be a problem with deposition because osteoblasts are responsible for the deposition portion of bone remodeling. Okay. All right. Okay, folks. I can see I'm out of time, and so let me tell you how I'm going to handle this. Okay, I'm gonna stop taking notes at the moment. We'll take a break. We'll come back to lab. When we get lab started, I'm going to finish giving you this section of notes because I want to get this section of notes completed so I am in a good starting point for the next lecture. That'll take 5-10 minutes. We'll finish this. We'll start lab. We'll go over the histology packet, get you all the correct answers, talk about some items of relevance for the lab exam, and we'll get you ready for that, okay? So let's take a nice break at this time. Let's start lab at 9:35, and the Zoom channel will stay on so you do not have to log off, okay? So take a break, and if you have questions, hold on to them, give them to me in lab, and we'll take care of them, okay? So see you at 9:35. Hi, folks. Welcome back. Okay, let's see if we can get started here again. I do want to finish the notes that we were talking about in lecture here about the vitamins and so forth. So let me just take a few minutes to do that, and then we'll get started with lab this morning. Just share my screen with you. Okay. So as we were saying, there's a variety of minerals that are important for the processes of bone growth and remodeling. There's also a variety of enzymes that play a role, a variety of enzymes and vitamins that play a role here. Vitamin C, everybody knows about vitamin C. Vitamin C is important for a lot of things, but in terms of bone growth and remodeling, it's absolutely critical to support the synthesis of collagen fibers. Vitamin C is important for the production of collagen. Vitamin D, as you know, is important for the absorption of calcium from food. This is going to be a major talking point of our lecture next week. But for right now, we'll just list this down. Vitamin D is important for the absorption of calcium from food. And of course, we know, we've said it before that calcium is involved in a lot of processes in the body. And now simply because we've walked through, we have walked through intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. We read through the stages. There were some stages there when it talks about calcification and the primary ossification centers. Those things require a lot of calcium, okay? All right, in addition to that, vitamins K and B12 are needed for the synthesis of additional proteins that are important for bone health. Okay, so when mom and dad years ago said, you gotta eat your fruits and vegetables, we need your vitamins, that really was not a lie, even though they don't always taste good. Okay, So minerals are important, vitamins are important, hormones. Let's talk about hormones briefly. Okay, now you haven't had formal coverage of the endocrine system yet. You will get that in AMP2, but I know you're aware of hormones. I mean, you've had that in health class in high school at some point. You've all heard of insulin. You know, insulin is a hormone. We associate insulin with sugar metabolism. Well, folks, there are other hormones that are very similar to insulin, and they're called insulin-like growth factors. Insulin-like growth factors. Okay. These are specialized proteins that have a chemical structure that resembles insulin. Okay, these particular insulin-like growth factors are made by cells of your bones and also by cells of the liver. Okay, these insulin-like growth factors, they stimulate cell division. They stimulate mitosis to enable cells to get longer at the epiphyseal plate. And they also stimulate mitosis of the periosteum membrane, covering the compact bone so that as the bone itself needs to grow, the membrane around the bone also needs to accommodate that growth by also increasing in size. Okay, so insulin-like growth factors stimulate bone growth at the epiphyseal growth plate. And also stimulate mitosis of cells in the periosteum so that the membrane can grow at the same time the bone is growing. Okay. I mean, if the membrane didn't grow, that'd be kind of like you growing but not wearing any larger clothing, right? It would quickly get uncomfortable, wouldn't it? Okay, let's continue here. So insulin-like growth factors are hormones. They are special proteins involved in bone physiology. We have hormones from the thyroid gland. In this case, T3 and T4 hormones are important. These hormones from the thyroid gland promote bone growth by stimulating osteoblast activity. Okay, so T3 and T4 are going to support the bone deposition process. And then we come to insulin itself, right? Insulin, as you know, is a hormone that we associate with sugar metabolism. We often think about it in the context of treating the disease called diabetes mellitus. That's all correct stuff. That's all good stuff. It's all relevant stuff. But the reality of it is that insulin as a molecule in your body does more things than just regulate sugar levels in the bloodstream. It's kind of like you. Think about yourself. You are my student, but you are somebody's daughter or son. You might be somebody's father or mother. You are very likely somebody's employee. You might be somebody's supervisor. You might be somebody's volunteer. Right? You can be called by many labels because while you are the same person, you do multiple roles in society. You do different things. You wear different hats at different times. The molecules of your body are no different. While we can say one thing about a molecule, Mother Nature almost always has multiple roles in that same molecule, even if us as scientists and people don't know what all those roles actually are. So insulin also stimulates bone growth by stimulating the production of proteins needed to support growth. Okay. So insulin is involved in the health of your bones, folks. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention some of our sex hormones. Okay, testosterone and estrogen. Both of these hormones are involved in promoting bone growth during times of our development, particularly when we reach puberty, right? And the boys and girls go through their growth spurts respectively and get a lot rapidly, very rapidly. So testosterone and estrogen also stimulate bone growth. Okay. All right, folks. So that's just a quick summary of some of the hormones that are involved in bone physiology. You'll go into much greater depth with these sorts of topics when you get to the endocrine chapter in AMP 2. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask at this time? Okay. All right. Please let me know if you do have any questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen momentarily here. And since I'm done lecturing, I'm going to stop the recording. Okay.